Gamer Type Originals.
My name is Paul Serene. There are those who would question my actions. I'm recording this as a final statement of vindication, a testimony of how things came to be.
Time is going to end. Jack, you have to trust me.
No matter what we do, the pieces fall in all of the exact same places. I've tried.
I think that's Jack Joyce!
I've seen the end of time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Don Magic.
It's hard to believe it's been 3 years since the perpetually slick-looking Don Matrick stepped on stage inside a Big Tent at Microsoft's campus to sell us on their new vision of gaming. Matrick is the business guy who turned the innovative but fatally flawed Kinect peripheral into the Xbox 360 second wind when Wii sales fell off a cliff. So even if he always came across as a corporate robot, it didn't seem there was much of a way he could steer the good ship Xbox wrong. But after an hour of watching Microsoft executives shuffle on stage and deliver key points, it was clear that Microsoft was treating the Xbox as a post-games brand. The Xbox One wouldn't be the cutting-edge game-playing machine that millions of Xbox fans were expecting. It would be a powerful multimedia device that also happened to play the newest versions of Forza, Fable, and Halo. Microsoft wouldn't just build games internally, it'd flesh out those universes with exclusive scripted content, like a collaboration between Steven Spielberg and Halo developer 343 Industries that still hasn't materialized. Microsoft wanted to compete with Sony's massive entertainment arm head-on, with a new Los Angeles-based production studio to develop all this content internally as well. As a fanboy, it was an interesting presentation. I didn't have a cable box to plug into my console, so all of that TV functionality was useless, but I was absolutely in love with the idea of being able to install a game from a disc, and it never needed again because of the console's controversial DRM scheme. I wanted a new Forza Horizon, I loved the Metro UI, I wanted a new Xbox. But watching Matrick smile to the crowd, I realized something was wrong. History had made examples of hubristic video game frontrunners. Sega's empire fell due to poor leadership out of Japan. Nintendo's empire fell to Sony's compact discs. Sony had fumbled with the PlayStation 2's massive lead by over-engineering the PlayStation 3 and launching hardware at $499 US. Now here was Microsoft thinking that their success with the Xbox 360 guaranteed them enough clout to debut the Xbox One with only a glance at their game offerings, as if Matrick and his crew, including a now apologetic Phil Spencer, didn't realize that each generation requires a new robust contract with the gaming audience. But Microsoft wasn't entirely out of their minds. EA was there, as they are with every new console generation, to unveil a bunch of technology that won't look nearly as shiny or interesting when it arrives on store shelves. Forza and Call of Duty were there, of course, but the Hail Mary to satiate the hardcore came in an unexpected title from Remedy called Quantum Break that would marry a time-traveling action shooter with a scripted series, somehow. It came as a bit of a shock to me, not because of how awkward the combination seemed, even though Remedy has always sought to create very cinematic games, but because their previous big collaboration, Alan Wake, had not been a barn burner. The survival horror/action game, focused on the nightmarish adventures of its titular author coming to life, did eventually make money and spawn a kinda cool in American Nightmare. Maybe Microsoft believed that a more action-oriented game in Quantum Break would summon the success of their earlier Max Payne games. Maybe they believed that retaining an experienced European auteur like Sam Lake, in much the same way that Sony fosters David Cage's odd ambitions at Quantic Dream, was good business. Mirroring the lengthy development of their last game, it would still take 3 more years for Quantum Break to arrive. As the game wandered from press conference to press conference, actors and sequences changed, leaving the original teaser almost completely inconsistent with the plot that would eventually land on Xbox One hard drives. The biggest question over the years seemed to be how the game would work with its live-action TV sequences, especially as a regime change at Microsoft shut down their new Xbox Entertainment Studios, ending their television ambitions. It seems the best way to review Quantum Break is as a game first, then as a show. So let's see how Remedy's time-shredding experience survived Microsoft's own fumbled ambitions.
No!
Quantum Break is all about manipulating time. Yeah, it's a shooter, But after the player's Jack Joyce is exposed to an extreme amount of chronon radiation, he's also able to stop and slow down time to wander around and defeat his foes even as he's outnumbered, out-armored, outgunned, and armed with little more than a sketchy history of criminal mischief and whatever weaponry happens to be available. It's odd then that Quantum Break feels anachronistic compared to its contemporaries. Whether it's the lack of blind fire from cover, the lack of interesting weapons, or the time-oriented platforming sections, Quantum Break feels like the product of its predecessors. If we look back through the catalog, we can begin to understand why Remedy made this game how they did. Releasing on the Rockstar label 3 months before Grand Theft Auto 3 made it a big deal, the original Max Payne basically made third-person shooters what they are today. Matched with a comically weird and dark noir story that could have only been cooked up by Finnish nerds, Max Payne introduced us to an interactive version of bullet time during that small slice of history we were still feverishly hot about the Matrix. With the press of a button, you could tap your adrenaline gauge to slow down time and outmaneuver your opponents, allowing the game to surprise you with enemies from all angles. Of course, no one will forget the Trail of Blood Nightmare sequence, a portion of the game that, even at the end of the 3D platforming boon, was a barely acceptable platforming section. Max Payne 2, which was produced overnight by Remedy standards, was a darker, more dramatic experience. The game only tweaked the gunplay formula slightly, but Remedy's focus was on expanding their cinematic scope with more sophisticated in-game scripting and detail. Max Payne 2 didn't move the needle too far holistically, but then bullet time and shoot dodging still worked. Max Payne was a successful game that made lots of money. Why mess with the formula? Alan Wake, on the other hand, was something very different. We saw it for the first time at E3 2005, and it traded Max Payne's gritty gunplay for a slower gameplay loop as an open-world psychological thriller. They had the time, money, and support to do whatever they wanted, and they were no doubt inspired by the success of Grand Theft Auto. But in 6 years of development, they couldn't get it to work. They couldn't make an open world consistently scary. The rebooted, far more linear game was episodic like a TV series, with cinematic bookends and rehashes. In retrospect, even though the game could be binged like a show on Netflix, it gave you the perfect excuse to stop after each episode and reflect, or really, just stop wandering around in the woods shooting apparitions. With rarely more than a trusty revolver and a limited supply of bullets, Alan Wake fought through a facsimile of the Pacific Northwest trying to find his wife. Replacing bullet time was a tedious gameplay combo that required you to kill each enemy twice, once to remove their shivering shroud with your flashlight, and again to dispatch their semi-corporeal form with your firearm. With a lack of variation in encounters and weaponry, and the frustrating scarcity of ammunition, the only thing that kept me going through to the end was the story. I can safely say the most disappointing moment in a video game ever came halfway through the third episode when, after trudging through a forest killing ethereal lumberjacks and thugs, I was to meet with my wife's kidnapper in broad daylight. Except the kidnapper never shows up, and the game time lapses to night, dooming me to yet another slog through the hillside. It doesn't seem accurate to say I beat Alan Wake when, in fact, it was Alan Wake that beat me up. Remedy must have picked up on this issue because for its American Nightmare Kinda Cool and Quantum Break, they returned to their old Max Payne era action loop by giving you more ammo and pushing you towards your enemies. In fact, Remedy is all about pushing players forward, which is why certain aspects of Quantum Break, like the cover, don't feel quite as satisfying as they do in its contemporaries. Remedy never wants you to sit still unless you're ogling the scenery during the lulls. This goes back to Max Payne, a point in time where discrete cover mechanics or tighter iron sights aiming were standards for a distant future. As Max Payne, you're at your strongest when you're at your most vulnerable. You don't have the weaponry or accuracy to take down enemies from a distance, you need to get up close as they attack from anywhere and everywhere. Bullet time lets you stop and manage enemies, but your surest aim isn't from cover, it's point blank. You have to keep pushing forward. Even in Alan Wake, your only defense is a just-in-time dodge maneuver. True safety can only be achieved by being aggressive. Even though Quantum Break introduces Remedy's first cover mechanic, the game still forces you to move forward. Cover isn't a place you can hunker behind for long, especially as so much of it's destructible, and Monarch specialists are flanking you with deadlier deterrents. Most of your weaponry, on the other hand, isn't designed to be used over long distances, so you'll push forward by freezing distant foes with your time powers while you hop from cover to cover. Your ability to stop enemies temporarily is also a good conceit to bring back bullet time for a new era, as you queue up a stream of bullets to destroy enemies, or break their faces with a powerful melee. This also gives the game a reason, for better or worse, to dismiss firearm management. Quantum Break gives you enough guns and ammo to complete your mission, and you'll rarely think too much about which weapon to use, as they come across as equally effective when combined with your time powers and the game's short to mid-range encounters. Again, you spent most of Alan Wake wandering around the woods with your trusty revolver, so if you were just given an assault rifle and nothing else, you'd probably be just as effective in any scenario here. Maybe the illusion of choice makes more sense in a game like this. It's Remedy's philosophy of always pushing forward that makes Rockstar's sequel Max Payne 3 feel so weird, because your Brazilian enemies are constantly attacking from a distance with great accuracy. Cover becomes a crutch because of your limited health, turning each counter and set piece into a shooting gallery rather than a dynamic in-your-face gunplay of its predecessors. Your enemies are Monarch security employees in body armor and fancy time suits. Their most interesting weapon seems to be their constant commentary.
Reloading shotgun! I'm empty!
As a counter to your time powers, many of your opponents will come equipped with time manipulation suits, so they can move around just as dynamically as you do. Halfway through, the game introduces chronon dampeners that mute your time abilities until you shut them down. All these are interesting little tweaks, but it can get especially frustrating when you're having to balance your powers and your weaponry against foes with specific weak points. This comes to a head in the game's final encounter against Serene. I'd made it through the entire game to that point, only hitching up on specific encounters, but when Serene is bombarding you with area of effect attacks while I'm managing recharge times and ammo counts, I found myself stuck until I ratcheted down the difficulty. Like the final encounter of Bioshock Infinite, after the game has spent so much time forcing you to use different powers for different situations, it's a bit overwhelming for a game to require you to fire on all cylinders for a final encounter. Or maybe I just suck at games. That's possible too. As each pod of enemies is dispatched in Quantum Break, the final soldier gets a special panning animation to indicate you can move on. But this felt oddly lacking compared to the more dramatic animations of the Max Payne games or the explosive particle effects of Alan Wake. Your time-traveling opponents don't even explode in a blaze of orange glory, they just kinda hang in the air. It's actually disappointing. Well, it's kind of fun, but mostly disappointing. The game's levels have received a lot of attention, which makes them a lot of fun to fight through. Max Payne 2 had some pretty memorable spaces, but also plenty of warehouses and unfinished structures to grind through, and from the first moments we saw Alan Wake, it became clear that Remedy had mastered world design. While you're still fighting through dilapidated structures and warehouses, or mundane spaces like conference rooms, these level designs are solid and memorable. The game's excellent graphic design isn't just limited to the menus and UI, it's plastered throughout the environments. As you wander through Monarch's offices, you see a fully realized brand from the signage to the informational placards. Check out the geometry of Monarch's design on their patios and catering tables. Even the junk in Williams' lab is sensibly laid out in a way that feels like a callback to Half-Life 2's dangling wires and stark machinery, juxtaposed against environments that were never designed to house them. And then we get to the terrors. This is a game based on the premise that the flow of time has been stopped like a clogged conveyor belt. Time is simply falling apart, and throughout this world we see absolutely glorious displays of objects moving in and out of time, of soldiers being struck shooting at a target they will never hit, of objects being stuck in reverberating motion like a turntable being scratched back and forth, glitching in and out. Geometry distorts around your character perfectly, making you feel like your movements are somehow aiding in the destruction of the universe. The manipulations carry over to the sound design as we hear soldiers' voices being lost to the stretch of time, or the soundtrack remixing as it dances around your button press manipulations like a hyperactive rhythm action game. If we were just shooting our way through these set pieces, that'd be one thing, but Remedy continues to try and impress with platforming sections that never feel great. Freezing objects in space or rewinding them to a time where you can scale them is a visually interesting effect, like when Monarch's men disassemble a coastal defense cannon in reverse, but these Blinks-like puzzles are rarely interesting. Games like Uncharted or Assassin's Creed do something substantially more interesting with world traversal because they feel natural, rather than serving as a contrived showcase to remind you of your abilities. Here's one example where the game fumbles. In a warehouse early on, you need to get into a side room, but the door is blocked by explosive barrels. Now this opening in the wall is big enough that Jack could easily just crawl through it, but the game doesn't want you to think like that, probably because Remedy didn't want to make those animations. Instead, it still wants you to blow up the barrels and trigger a voiceover exchange. But now what? Your way forward is blocked because the shelves you just knocked over are in the way. Now you have to rewind time to clear the shelves to climb the rear stairs to reach the ladder. This entire sequence only exists because you couldn't just vault through a big hole in the wall. Visually, the game looks perfect if you squint. Don't get me wrong, it has some very memorable moments and set pieces like the tears in the fabric of time. Tile floors are imperfect, and the junk, well, it looks like junk. But there are visual imperfections that aren't obviously part of Remedy's act. I thought texture popping had been rectified by these new consoles' vast pools of fast RAM, but I was wrong. There were times when I thought the game was covertly being rendered on Microsoft's cloud and then sent back because of the variety of weird texture artifacting and odd trails as things move around the screen. Volumetric lighting or even curtains look weird and grainy, a visual oddity that looks like an error rather than complementing the film grain filter. These weird flashes of light? No idea what those are. As a game, Quantum Break works. It's not a visceral experience to play, it's a visceral experience to watch. It rarely exceeds, but it rarely insults either. I never collected enough Chronon elements in the environment to do a whole lot with the talent tree, so maybe that's on me. This is the grandson of Max Payne and it plays like it. It leaves me to wonder what would have happened if they had a proper stealth mechanic, or if the game let you combo kills in the same way you could slice through Max Payne. What if they had followed in Rockstar's wake and saved the jumping stuff for cutscenes? I just don't know. Remedy doesn't seem to be in the business of setting gameplay trends anymore. They set the world on fire with Max Payne, and now the House of Lake has moved on to bigger, better things, like creating interactive cinematic experiences. Max Payne 2 and Alan Wake weren't just games, they were envelopes of intricate artistic endeavor, and every square inch of Quantum Break definitely feels like it's been worked on for years. So the question becomes, how is the Quantum Break cinematic experience? Well...
What do you know about our customers, Adrian? You've never even been on a bike.
Well, you know I'd be on one right now, sir, if it weren't for my destabilizing inner ear condition.
Ah, your ears are fine. It's what's between them that scares me.
Let's talk about cutscenes for a minute, because I used to love the stupid things. My household got into video games in the mid-90s, around the time that the Super Nintendo was peaking and CD-ROM drives were becoming standard in personal computers. Games like Siberia, Creature Shock, Full Throttle, and TIE Fighter used the compact disc to create visually elaborate stories. To me, this was the future of gaming, and it's a huge reason why I drifted toward the PC over the console. As hardware got more powerful, 3D rendering picked up, and games like Half-Life, Grand Theft Auto 3, and Halo sold me on the magic of telling as much of the story as possible in-game and in-engine, instead of in the lengthy cutscenes of Japanese flagships like Final Fantasy X or Metal Gear Solid 2, where you could set your controller down for up to 45 minutes at a time. Even in recent times, I'm disappointed that 343 Industries switched to elaborate pre-baked cinematics for their Halo games, instead of relying on their game engine's technical prowess like Bungie did with their entries, warts and all. Now, I'm not opposed to a long cutscene, but I've reached a point where sectioning off the narrative from the actual game just doesn't do much for me. It's interesting to report that Quantum Break tells its story both ways. On one hand, and much like Alan Wake, Quantum Break is split into 5 acts that tell the story from the perspective of the player protagonist Jack Joyce, blending action and storytelling. On the other hand, while Wake had some cinematic padding between acts to move you from location to location, Quantum Break doubles down with 4 TV-length shows that serve to tell the alternate stories of villain Paul Serene and his high-ranking employees at Monarch Solutions. Quantum Break opens with a fracture, actually the beginning of the fracture. Jack Joyce is invited home to Riverport by childhood friend Paul Serene. Paul's been working with Jack's brother William on a time machine, but when William suggests that the device isn't up to snuff, investors get cold feet. Now Paul is desperate to the point of recklessness to activate the device to assuage their fears, and he wants Jack on board to assist him in changing the world. The machine works at first when Paul runs into himself from 5 minutes in the future, which is kind of a magical moment in the game. You really get to enjoy how the time travel mechanism works, from the lab here, to the small scale in Williams Pool, to Monarch's own monstrous rendition. It shouldn't make sense that walking through a makeshift hallway will send you back or forward through time, but Remedy makes you believe it. The second time Paul has you apply the gas, however, things go terribly wrong, as William shows up, paranoid and deranged, to stop this party cold. Paul gets trapped inside the machine and it creates the fracture, an event that will wind up unzipping the fabric of space-time. In the quantum panic that ensues, Jack gains the ability to alter time himself. As Jack and William escape Monarch's invading security teams, they run into Paul Serene again, now significantly older and ruthless, imbued with the same time powers that Jack has, but now also backed by a private army of well-armed henchmen. This older Serene has seen the end of time and is doing everything in his power to stop it, even if it means murdering some old friends. Over the course of the game, you'll work back and forth through time as you discover not only how William experimented with time travel over the course of 20 years, but how Paul Serene went from a troublemaking childhood friend to a desperate corporate tyrant. As you finish each act, the story switches from Jack's perspective to Paul's at the game's junction points, a binary choice that grants you some small degree of freedom to tweak the events of both the story and the show. Telltale-style stats afterward explain how many of your friends in the community at large agreed or disagreed with your actions. As a time travel narrative, the story's complexity lies somewhere between yesterday's Enterprise and Primer, which is to say it's easy to get lost. It's neat that there's always more going on than what you see on screen, especially as you revisit the same scenes from different times with different intentions, but you may also feel underwhelmed if you don't put in the extra mileage to figure it out. It's been 2 months since I've beat the game and I still have questions about individuals' motivations or their timing in the grand scheme of things. While the game and the show explain enough to keep things moving, you're not going to get a whole lot of answers unless you put in plenty of extracurricular snooping by accosting every computer you see and scouring its included emails. To be frank, it's not a great storytelling conceit. Audio logs and emails have served as a narrative crutch in games for years, but even if you can get over the fact that very private schemes against Paul Serene from within his own corporation are easily accessible to anyone passing by a Monarch computer, reading some of these lengthy email chains in reverse chronological order sure does get annoying fast. Quantum Break's MacGuffin is the countermeasure. William builds the device in secret to prevent the fracture, while Paul Serene wants to use it as the heart of a lifeboat deep within Monarch's obsidian spire to survive the end of time. You see, Quantum Break isn't about just time travel, it's about time shredding to bits. It's stopping, starting, and stalling all around you, breaking up in crackling glass-like shards. Stutters are localized events that allow you to move freely among the static populace or carefully sidestep dramatic set pieces like a massive cargo ship destroying the Port Donnelly Bridge. As the game chugs toward a conclusion, the older Paul's apocalyptic premonitions seem more and more real. Time lapses are vivid and incredible to watch. The game really sells you on the madness that breaking time permanently will cause. My favorite part of the game might be when you arrive in Paul Serene's private office, and you can see the elaborate timeline he established to build Monarch from scratch to become the mighty imperialistic entity that exists when the game starts. The story of Quantum Break is a bit too much to try and cover here, but it's genuinely interesting to see how many different parts weave together back and forth through time. So now we get to the show, which genuinely feels like Microsoft granting Remedy its long-awaited wish of cinematic release. Creating a TV series has always been sort of a pet project for Remedy. Every one of their games features sporadically placed television sets playing memorable skits like Lords and Ladies, Captain Baseball Bat Boy, Dick Justice, or Night Springs. Now that Remedy spends roughly an hour and a half telling the story of Quantum Break through dedicated scripted storytelling, the role of the world's televisions as a venue for quirky sketches and side stories has been rolled back in much the same way that Pixar eventually shed the blooper reels from its films. It gives Quantum Break a more even tone, but this is still a story that has a lot of fun with its premise. It's an adventure that almost feels bubbly and innovative compared to the grimy, mean-spirited yarn of Max Payne 3, a game that felt dark to the point of punishment. But then an episode of the Quantum Break show starts, and it's not long before I had to wonder, why? I'm not opposed to the idea of 22-minute cinematics in this game because it isn't at the exclusion of its other stronger forms of storytelling. The idea that you can spend this controller-free downtime digesting what Monarch's employees are doing in the wake of all this quantum breaking is genuinely interesting, but the show has two major issues. The first is that the tone and pacing are dramatically inconsistent with what you play. The show tries to build up far too many characters and cram too many events into their relatively small, multi-threaded episodes. While the game keeps you plugging along, minus the occasional chunks of level I got lost in, the show feels slow.
I gotta go.
The game has the advantage of only needing to serve one perspective, Jack Joyce's, but the show needs to set up Monarch Security Chief Liam Burke, the Animatics CEO Martin Hatch, the goofy nerd Charles Wincott, plus a number of others. Then it has to provide for Paul Serene's own story needs too. There's genuinely too much going on, and it's easy to think that these segments might be better served if they were twice as long. Or maybe the game would do better to pick up the slack of a few other characters. Still, the show isn't resourceful with its time. In one junction point, I chose to deal with Jack Joyce personally instead of letting Martin deal with him. The result is a very unnatural conversation that doesn't explain anything. These are lifelong friends who deserve a fantastic mid-game conversation that defines their philosophies, especially on Paul's end. But in the end, you're wondering if they had to cut out all the good parts so they didn't drag down the pace of the episode. The second major issue is that the show looks incredibly cheap. Imagine you're watching Star Wars The Force Awakens, and for a 20-minute segment in the middle, it cuts to Caravan of Courage, an Ewok adventure. That's how these episodes feel against the backdrop of the elaborate production values within the game itself. Maybe producing an hour and a half of in-engine cinematics was cost prohibitive, or Xbox Entertainment Studios really wanted a workout before they were shuttered, but everything in the show looks like a sweetened version of what happens in the game. It's not just that producing these shows in engine would have looked dramatically better, the action would have also benefited as well. A hallway fight between Burke and some of Monarch's strikers could have been hands-on and explosive, instead of looking like a bunch of stuntmen meekly standing around in costumes, enhanced by underwhelming After Effects compositions. What if you could have a car chase where being rained on by automatic weaponry actually caused damage to the vehicle? What if Paul Serene's lifeboat didn't feel like a couple dozen extras standing around in an empty parking garage? These shows don't have commercials, but I haven't seen as many Lumia phones or Surface tablets in the real world as I did during the time I played this game. The show isn't a total loss, though. It works hard to fill in details as it weaves back into Jack's narrative. Shawn Ashmore is a great choice for Jack's enthusiastic brainiac, and Lance Reddick is perfect as Paul's loyal colleague. But I have my questions about Aidan Gillen's portrayal of Paul. He can yell and scream like no one's business, and his physical presence is fantastic, but he's far too mellow, far too serene. I don't know if a more intense portrayal or a spiced up script would have done the character better, but even as he's committing all kinds of evil stuff in his hubristic crusade to stop the end of time, he's never menacing. I don't feel threatened by him as a character, especially when, behind the scenes, it's clear he has his own issues. I realize I'm supposed to sympathize with him, but Serene, like the show itself, just doesn't quite pull it off. You can tell that at some point years ago, this was all on paper and made a lot more sense. But as Quantum Break churns through, hour after hour, shifting gears dramatically, it's obvious that its disparate pieces were set wrong, or hooked unevenly, and the Dewey show segments are proof.
Hey, do you know where the physics building is?
You mean the big-ass metallic turtle behind me? Hard to miss, man.
Thanks.
Quantum Break is really, really interesting. The time-bending premise is fantastic, the set pieces are amazing, the gunplay can even be really exciting from time to time. With Quantum Break, it feels like Remedy cut corners on their usually solid competencies in service of a different way of storytelling that didn't really pay off. There's a reason why games aren't made like this, and Remedy bit off far more than it could chew in manifold service of both their own cinematic ambitions as well as Microsoft's once great plans of being a first-party game maker and TV show producer. Both Remedy and Microsoft took a risk with Quantum Break, much like they did with Alan Wake, and that's honestly refreshing. If Sam Lake had shopped Quantum Break around, I guarantee no one else would have bit, because only Remedy can make Remedy games. I want Remedy to continue to make Remedy experiences, especially when a developer like Quantic Dream continues to receive millions of Sony's dollars to produce games with emotionally tone-deaf and incomprehensible stories. That said, I can't help but feel Remedy needs to revisit the basics that made them great in the first place, and I know they have the talent to pull it off. I just hope Quantum Break, to some extent, is just a fracture we can move beyond. 6 out of 10. It may not be the first, but it is the nth review. I've been your host, Nick Pfeiffer. Be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out my previous review for Just Cause 3. Don't forget to head over to gamertype.com for more original content and adventure, and hey, I'll see you next time.
Forget Will, Jack. Forget Will, Jack. However, we forget Will, Jack. Forget Will, Jack. He's done. Forget Will, Jack. Forget Will, Jack. What's going on, Paul? Forget Will, Jack. 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 Forget Will, Jack.